Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome back to Clearer Than Truth. Today we're joined by two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist and acclaimed historian H.W. Brands. From the Founding Fathers to the Cold War, he has spent decades pulling the messy reality of American leadership out from under the weight of myth. Today we're digging into the pivotal moments that shaped our nation, the human flaws behind the legends, and what history can actually teach us about the present. H.W., thanks for joining.
Glad to be with you.
You recently wrote a book on Washington. I have a hunch that our leaders today are more mediocre than our leaders of our past. You've written about Washington, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, Eisenhower, Grant, I believe. But Reagan. But it doesn't seem that any of the leaders of our current time really live up to the leaders of the past. Am I wrong in that mistake?
Well, I mean, not to be unfair, but I've written about, and the people you've mentioned are they're in the Hall of Fame. So we write about the good ones. Not too many book-length biographies of James Buchanan and Millard Fillmore. So there are plenty of unmemorable presidents in the 19th century, especially. Now, that's not simply because of the people they were. It's because the presidency was the institution it was during the 19th century. It's only in the 20th century that the American presidency has become the center of focus, center of gravity of American politics. It wasn't designed that way. It was designed for Congress to take center stage. And the president would simply be an executive officer carrying out the will of Congress. But things changed in the 20th century for a variety of reasons, the most important of which is the emergence of a 24/7 American foreign policy. George Washington was America's diplomat-in-chief, as president. But he spent almost no time on foreign policy, and most presidents during the 19th century didn't. So, it's true that the greatest presidents of the past are greater than the presidents we've had lately, but the presidents we have lately, they're probably not Hall of Fame material, but neither were most presidents. So if you name the top 5 presidents out of 47, that's not very many. So I can't say that, George W. Bush and Barack Obama are terrible presidents by any means. I think they're competent presidents. Donald Trump is unique, and so time will tell how he is judged. But we get mediocre presidents more often than we get great presidents.
It's disappointing. I want to turn to Trump briefly in a moment, but before I go there, what makes a great president? What made Teddy? What made FDR? This is laid out in your fantastic book, Traitor to His Class, and the book on TR, which I think is just called TR. But what made them so uniquely fantastic?
Well, if there's one thing above anything else, it's the principal characteristic for success in a democratic political system, and that is you have to fit your times. So one of the arguments I make in my book on George Washington is he was great for his time, but his time ended as soon as he left office. And George Washington would not have been a good president had he come along 25 years later. In fact, he never would have been president had he come along later than he did. And a lot of students of history like to imagine, what would happen if we brought Teddy Roosevelt back today? Well, I have no idea how Teddy Roosevelt would do today because he fit his times very well. And this is absolutely crucial in a system of popular democracy because you can't be a monarch, you can't be a czar, you can't be too far ahead of your times. If you are, nobody will listen to you and you'll get no traction whatsoever. So you have to have at least one foot in the present moment. And of course, moments change. And so Andrew Jackson, fine in the 1820s and 1830s, but put him down in the 20th century, who knows?
Interesting. George, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I have a Trump question.
I would love to just ask if Jackson was kind of the most historically controversial figure you wrote about, because it seems as though there are lots that try to claim him, lots of people who try to repudiate him, and there are so many cities named after him. I don't know. It just seems like he's enigmatic, but in a controversial sort of way.
Well, it's controversial, but in fact, I deliberately chose to write about controversial presidents. And so Jackson was during his time. George Washington was not particularly. He's an exception. It's one of the reasons I waited until the end to write about him. But I wrote about Jackson. I wrote about Theodore Roosevelt. He was terrifically divisive during his time. He broke up his own party before he left office, before he left the public stage. Franklin Roosevelt, the title of my book is Traitor to His Class. And so it was, and when I poll audiences. So what do you think? Is Traitor to His Class a thumbs up kind of title or a thumbs down title? And they're about equally divided because they can't decide. Traitor, yeah, but to his class, maybe he should have been. Ronald Reagan. When I wrote about Ronald Reagan, I had this fond notion, turned out to be very naive, that we were far enough from the Reagan era that people might be willing to take an arm's length view of Reagan. And if I told his story, just kind of playing it down the middle and showing what he did well, what he did poorly, that maybe there would be a reception for that. Turned out I was absolutely wrong. People were just as worked up about Reagan on the left and on the right as they were when he was president. So there are other presidents who don't generate that kind of, passion, but if they're not so interesting to write about.
Well, how much time does it take to really evaluate a presidency? At what point can we evaluate Obama or Trump?
Oh, way too soon for those two. Because one of the reasons I say this is when I wrote the book on Franklin Roosevelt. This is almost a century after Roosevelt was president. And opinions are just as divided. And so when I talk about Franklin Roosevelt, I describe his New Deal, the reform program of the Democrats in the 1930s. And I personally, when I write about presidents, or when I write about any for that matter, I make a studied attempt to avoid standing in judgment upon them. So I describe the New Deal, and I describe how the New Deal looked to Franklin Roosevelt. He liked it. I described how the New Deal looked to Roosevelt's opponents. They didn't like it. And for my readers, I don't tell them the New Deal was a good deal or a bad deal. I do explain why the New Deal was a big deal. But I will say that you can get a pretty good argument even today on Franklin Roosevelt. So the answer to your question is that kind of it depends on the issues and it depends on the individual. We have almost no dispute anymore about Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was very polarizing during his time, but the issues that were raised during his time have largely either been agreed upon or gone away. I couldn't have said this quite so clearly in, say, the 1970s when the Republicans and Ronald Reagan talked about giving back the Panama Canal, which Theodore Roosevelt seized. So sometimes these issues come back, but eventually they die away. Abraham Lincoln, by far the most polarizing president in American history, half the country bolted when he was elected. You don't get much argument about Lincoln anymore. There aren't even many Southerners who are willing to take on Lincoln, and maybe in part because they realize that's probably a good thing the South didn't get away.
Fair enough. Obviously, we still have 2 more years of the Trump presidency, and he is a unique character in history. Who does he best compare to, if anyone, throughout our history? Is it someone like Grant with alleged allegations of corruption, Cleveland, or Hoover, or liberally FDR?
I would say it's FDR. And the reason I say FDR is because Trump's personality and presence have dominated the last decade of American history. And it'll be 12 years before he's off the scene. The way Franklin Roosevelt did. People loved Roosevelt and hated Roosevelt, but they couldn't get away from Roosevelt. And there was this decade from the 12 years, from 1933 to 1945, where every newspaper had Roosevelt above the fold on the front page. And the same thing is true with Donald Trump. So I don't know if the emotions that Trump has aroused are going to go away. A lot of it really depends on the big imponderable question is, it's clear that Donald Trump broke all sorts of precedents and norms that used to constrain presidents have managed not to constrain him. The question is he just a one-off? Is he going to be the one-time exception? And the Republican Party, to focus on them, will they sort of snap back? The Republican Party, in some ways, considered itself the more respectable of the parties and more respectful of tradition. Well, under Trump, it's been just the opposite. They've waived all norms and forgiven all insults. But is the Trump phenomenon, is it transferable? Suppose Trump decides to anoint J.D. Vance, say, he's my guy, elect him. Let's suppose he does get elected. Will he be able to play by Trump rules, or will the old rules apply? That's the big question. And if he plays by Trump rules, then one would have to say that Donald Trump is one of the 3 or 4 most influential presidents in American history to really break the mold of the presidency. Jackson did it in his own way. TR did it. And it might be Trump for the 21st century. And opinions will differ on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But there again, it's a matter of, it'll be a big thing if it happens.
One of the criticisms with Trump is that he doesn't necessarily spend a lot of time reading your books or other historians' books.
I've made that criticism of every president.
But is it the case that sort of policy is actually, have any leaders actually had a grand theory of what they wanted to do? Or is it the case that FDR was just throwing spaghetti at the wall with a New Deal and TR just kind of had an idea for a canal? And could you say that that Trump is similar to those leaders? Or have any leaders actually come in with like a deep understanding of the world and what they wanted to do and what the grand strategy is?
Yeah, two presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and Richard Nixon. So Roosevelt really did think about strategic affairs. He was a naval guy, and he thought strategy, and he's trying to figure out what the role of the United States should be, how it should be accomplished, and all of this. So he had a sense of strategy. As a tactical matter, he sometimes was more ad hoc. And so when some people in Panama thought they wanted to stage a revolt, okay, help you along, get the canal. With Richard Nixon had been a student of essentially American strategy since the 1940s. And he watched Dwight Eisenhower from the vantage point of being vice president. He had this scheme he observed the Soviet-Chinese bloc fracture in the 1960s. And he was already talking about taking advantage of that and trying to split China from the Soviet Union. He wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in 1967, and he knew he was going to be running for president in 1968. Even when he had done that, his opening to China seemed to surprise or shock some people. But it's really clear he had thought about it. Now, in the case of Nixon as president, it's a little hard to tease out how much was Nixon and how much was Henry Kissinger. But of course, the boss is the one who gets credit for what the subordinate does. So those two. Now, other presidents have been much more off the cuff. But Donald Trump has taken that to an extreme, to the extent that many other presidents have felt obliged to change course, maybe not to follow through on every campaign promise they made. But when they don't, or when they do change course, they have almost always gone out of their way to explain that there's an underlying consistency to what they have been doing. To presidents before Donald Trump, consistency had great value because it made people think, well, you're a president, so you're part of this institutions, and institutions are supposed to be predictable. And so if you're going to be a president, you can't just change your mind tomorrow from what you did yesterday. Donald Trump has basically blown that model out of the water. And he's adopted this model that he used apparently when he was negotiating business. Do your best to keep your counterpart off balance. And which is, it may or may not have worked well for Trump. Opinions differ on how successful he was in business negotiations. But at least one could say, fine, that's a strategy. And it doesn't really put much more at risk than the personal reputation of the particular business partner. It's a different matter when you're president of the United States, because the reputation of the United States is a big deal. And one of the reasons presidents give speeches and say stuff is that they want the world to be able to predict what the United States is going to do, because it makes for a more stable and predictable world. Now, Trump has taken this opposite view. It's not at all clear at this point that it's been a great success, and we'll see how it turns out.
I'd love to jump in here, just and kind of shift gears for a minute, because we're at the, it's kind of 250th anniversary of the United States. And often when I'm sort of talking with friends or colleagues from elsewhere in the world about our founding, I'm kind of, I struggle, but I feel like I get across a couple of points about why our history is so important to kind of world history. And yet their kind of position is, it's completely overshadowed by the Napoleonic Wars. Your founding was full of these contradictions and hypocrisies. And so, I wondered, would you agree that sort of if we're celebrating one particular thing at the 250th anniversary, it's kind of the founding of a government, and a government that's very special? Or is it something that's a bit more sort of broad and complicated than that in terms of the significance for world history?
So it's always complicated, but if you want to take something simple, the simple thing is the United States essentially did something that had never been done in history, that is to create a country, a nation out of whole cloth. So on July 3rd, 1776, there wasn't anything, and on July 4th, there was. Well, July 2nd is when they took the vote. But anyway, you get the idea. And so this was something new, to think that you could create a country. Every other country had grown up organically. So the French nation was 800, 900 years old. And other countries were similar. So there's that. What we had is a country by creed, a confessional country rather than an organic cultural country. That was something new. And it was based on this idea, this revolutionary idea, that people can govern themselves. This had been tried in small circumstances, in special circumstances. There was a Roman Republic, but it was mostly a republic for the people in the city of Rome and not outside. For the United States to attempt this was a big deal. Most people thought that the experiment would fail. There were people in the United States who wondered if it would fail or not. But it succeeded, and it's still going 250 years later. So what the United States gave to the world was this idea that basically the United States was what the rest of the world, almost, I'll make some big exceptions, wanted to become in the 20th century. So pretty much everybody adopted the idea that people should be able to govern themselves. Now, in some cases, there was more lip service to this than reality. But with the big boom in decolonization after 1945, countries around the world, India, countries of Asia, countries of Latin America, everywhere, they have to decide, what do they want to be? And most of them wanted to be something like the United States. So that's a big deal, and that's a big responsibility. And that's the enduring contribution of the United States. And this is why Napoleon was a dead end, in the sense that Napoleon was just one more of the autocrats that had been ruling the world from time immemorial. And Napoleon, his type didn't go away. Yeah, there were Hitler and there's Stalin and people like that, and Xi Jinping. So that model hasn't disappeared. But what the United States created was a competing model that proved, I would say, as of now, to be more attractive to more people than the autocratic model. So we'll call it a democratic model. You could split hairs as whether it's a Republican model or a democratic model or whatever it is. But the idea that people can govern themselves. Before the United States came along, conventional wisdom through history was that people have to be governed by somebody else. It could be a king, it could be an emperor, it could be a czar, whatever it could be. But what do people know? How can they govern themselves? I would say that this is America's great contribution, but it's also the enduring challenge for the United States, because America was this experiment in self-government. And it's one of those weird experiments that it can only fail. It can't ever definitively succeed, because if it succeeds for 250 years, and it has, it could fail in the 251st year. So what I tell audiences, I tell my students that we are now part of this experiment. And one of the things I tell my students on the last day of the spring semester, after I've taught a year-long course in American history from before the founding to the present, I say, okay, now the burden is on you, because these are young people who are 18, 19 years old. Say, you become heirs to this 250-year experiment in self-government. Whatever you do, don't screw it up. Because that's the thing. Every generation can't really make it succeed. All we can do is screw it up. So it's this tightrope act that we're always walking.
It seems that it has succeeded for 250 years for the most part, but you could argue it's failing now. We have a population where people are at severe risk of real problems: disorder, crime, climate change, money in elections. It seems like it could fail soon. Has this sense of doom that there seems to be in the public discourse always been there throughout history?
Not always. It's come and gone. There were moments when things looked pretty good. So for 10 years after the American victory over Britain in the American Revolution, things looked pretty good. Okay, it's going well. There was a time in the early 19th century that was so bold as to call itself the era of good feelings. Everything was going well. But there were other times during the 1850s. During the 1850s, there really was a sense of impending doom, because it was quite clear that a large portion of the American population wanted to leave, didn't want to have anything to do with the United States anymore. And there was a strong suspicion that if they did try to leave, there would be a nasty war. As, of course, there was. And then the Civil War ends, Reconstruction comes along, and nobody really thinks anymore about seceding. I talk about secession or a civil war, but nobody's really acted on it seriously. I should add that if you think that there's a sense of dissatisfaction in the United States, there's always a sense of dissatisfaction in the United States. You can pick even the most golden age. For people of my generation, I was born in the 1950s. Some people my generation and maybe our parents look back on the 1950s, and the 1950s are often cited as this golden age of American white picket fences and one breadwinner in a family and the whole thing. But if you had lived in the 1950s, you would have been First of all, you would have thought that there's labor struggle, there's racial strife, there's wars that we're getting involved in or barely staying out of. So every generation has its problems. I would add one thing, and one of the bits of evidence that's cited to show that America's republic is about to fail is that the deeply partisan nature of American politics. Well, I want to look at the history of this, and I wrote a book on the 1790s. And the book's called Founding Partisans, and it's about the emergence of party politics. And partisan politics were as nasty in the 1790s as they are now. And in some ways, they were worse. So the most celebrated, the most infamous duel in American history rose out of that decade when Aaron Burr shot and killed Alexander Hamilton. Well, we haven't had any lethal duels lately, so we're still there. But one of the things I also point out is that, the only thing worse than a bitterly divided two-party system is a one-party system. And in a one-party system, you don't argue about partisanship. You don't argue about division or polarization because nobody gets to argue about anything. So the fact that we can argue about this, the fact that we can have these fights, we can say nasty things about one another, this is a sign that our system is working. Because in any group of people, there are going to be individuals of strong mind and differing views. And those views can either be muzzled and silenced, or they can be allowed to be spoken. And we've chosen to let them be spoken. And so it can get annoying, and it can be carried too far. Sometimes the rhetoric really can get carried away. But for the most part, the fact that we can argue with each other, we can join people like us in opposing parties, that's a sign of American freedom and the fact that the system is working.
Yeah, to push back a little bit, the one difference is that throughout much of our history, people trusted where they got their news. People get their news now from TikTok and Instagram Reels where anything can be said, and it's quite often not rooted in the truth, for one. And then for two, a lot of people would argue we have almost state-run media in different places, and that voices who are opposed to whether it's Obama or Trump are pushed back against, and I think that the world we're in today is significantly different from the past. Am I wrong in that?
Well, you're right that we do have this divided media, but you're wrong if you're implying that this is new. In fact, in the 1790s, the media of the day were newspapers. And there was no such thing as a neutral, an unbiased, a bipartisan or disinterested newspaper. The newspapers were, in fact, created as organs of political parties.
The Globe, for example, with Andrew Jackson?
Exactly. Yeah. And so the idea that newspapers should be or could be neutral is an artifact of the 20th century in the United States. And it largely follows from the fact that, well, in the era when I was growing up, maybe a little bit before your time, the principal medium was broadcast television. And broadcast television was unique. Certainly it was distinctive in the history of media in that there is space for only a small number of broadcast networks. And so the Federal Communications Commission created this so-called fairness doctrine. And so if you were CBS or ABC or NBC, if you aired a Democrat, you had to air a Republican because there was limited band space. But that was just a moment in time, and that went away with the creation of cable television in the 1970s and 1980s. And so the fact that people today are sort of expressing wonder that there is this partisan press and that you don't get the full side of every story from every paper as though that's something new. It might be new to them, but it's not new in history at all. And in many other countries, in Britain, for example, you picked your paper according to your party, and you didn't expect it otherwise.
The other difference, though, and this ties into what we were talking about before we started, and then after this, George, I'll let you run for as many as you like, but this is, I think, interesting, which is throughout history, people have actually watched the news or they've read, and we were talking about how people are reading less and less now. What impact does a lack of reading and a lack of understanding of history and a lack of sort of following politics, what impact does that have on public discourse and on having a smart and engaged populace? And what are the results if that doesn't happen?
Yeah, this is a real challenge. So democracy in the United States grew up with literacy in the United States, and the two seem to rest on each other. It was assumed that you could not have a democracy unless you had a literate voting group. They had to be able to understand, if at least they pursue their interests enough, to find out what they needed to know to vote on the issues of importance. And so we are entering, if we haven't already gotten there, an age of post-literacy, where people spend much less time getting their news from reading and getting instead from videos. And videos are a different thing. Videos, podcasts. Hey, what about that? And so this is a challenge. And it has always been the case that the idea of an informed electorate was an aspiration rather than a reality. There have been times in American history where people thought we should have literacy tests for voting. We did have some literacy tests, but usually they were devised to suppress the black vote in the South rather than ensure informed voters. And that's a tough one. It's a tough call to make. So it will represent a new challenge for American democracy. If indeed it is true, now I sometimes wonder whether this is exaggerated or not, but is it indeed the case that people who live in these different informational silos really think that their silo has all the information? Do they really think that their world is very different from the world of the other person? Or do they know that there's something else, but they just don't want to hear about it? So, I mean, that's something, if people really do live in different worlds, that can be a problem. One last thing on this, and that we live in a time when access to media is ubiquitous and everybody has a microphone. And in a case like that, the filtering system is who shouts the loudest, who says the most extreme stuff. And so I think that it's easy for us to draw unwarranted conclusions about the depth and the bitterness of the division in American politics. We hear the shouting from the far left and from the far right. The people toward the middle, they don't shout so much. We don't know who they are exactly and how many they are. So that's a bit of an imponderable at the moment.
Fascinating stuff. I'd love to ask a little bit about your craft as a historian. In the Washington book, I was really kind of struck by the need to often sort of infer about his state of mind. And, as I was growing up and learning about Washington, there were all these phrases associated with him, like he knew how to use silence. And I sort of wondered if that silence was imagined by the person saying he was using it. But Martha burned their letters, and, we have these diaries that are kind of wooden and implacable and John Wayne-esque. And so I just wonder, how did you get a texture for who this man was and trying to tell his story, kind of 250 years after his kind of epic acts of heroism?
Yeah, that's a challenge. There's no question about it. Because Washington did not bare his soul to anybody except maybe Martha, and then she burned the letters. So I sometimes wonder actually how revealing those letters would be. As far as I know, Washington did not really talk politics with Martha. And I don't think he shared his views on his subordinate generals, things like that. It's possible he did. He did occasionally write to his brothers and to a few close friends from Virginia, and he'd talk about it. He'd air his frustrations with the Continental Congress, for example. But with Washington, we do have to infer a lot of stuff from his actions. And Washington was not an eloquent speaker. He did not consider public speaking to be something that he was good at, or was interested in. And as a result of this, partly as a result of this, when he was in political circumstances, he was in some ways overshadowed by the talkers, by the Patrick Henrys and the Alexander Hamiltons and the James Madison types. But precisely because they were talking all the time, for example, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he said hardly a word. Well, he was president of the convention, which he interpreted to mean presiding officer of the convention, the guy who swings the gavel and says, okay, the session is now open. We will go into executive session. Now everybody argue, and I'll sit over here on the side and not speak up. He didn't weigh in on any of the debates of substance in the convention. But he did occasionally chide members if they weren't contributing to the mission of the convention. For example, there's one moment that I do cover in the book. The convention had been sworn to secrecy. It had been sworn to secrecy, and it had been informed by Washington that they must not take notes. Well, he was handed a copy of some notes that somebody had taken, and had taken them out of the convention hall. And so Washington held up the notes, and he said, this is a terrible thing. You must not do this. And And the other people around just started looking around. You could look to see which ones had been surreptitiously taking notes, because they were looking to see if they actually had their notes, and maybe this is one. So when he did speak, it carried great weight. Washington did not give night before the battle speeches to his troops, but when he did speak to his troops and his officers, it had great meaning. And so, for example, when the army was at Newburgh, New York, after Yorktown, but before the peace treaty had arrived, and some of the officers were getting restive because they had not been paid in many months, and they were being goaded on sort of surreptitiously by people like Alexander Hamilton, who suggested that they march on Philadelphia and put pressure on Congress, believing, Hamilton did, that that was the only way to get the Congress to act right. So Washington heard about this, and he was appalled. And so he let the instigators of the movement call a meeting of the officers. He was not invited. But the junior officers called this meeting. They're all gathered to decide what they should do. Should they heed this call to take action? And then when they were all together, Washington walked into the meeting. And of course, immediately that got everybody's attention. And he gave this kind of grandfatherly talk to all of them. And without using any histrionics or getting upset, he let the officers there know that he would be horribly disappointed in them if at this 11th hour they went back on their commitment to the national good. And he shamed them all into giving this up right away. So Washington, when he did speak, he spoke with great effect. And it was in large part because he spoke so seldom. I will add that nobody then, or for that matter, for the next 100 years, thought presidents, we'll get to Washington as president, thought presidents ought to speak. In fact, Washington did he gave two inaugural addresses, both very brief, the length of the Gettysburg Address. And then he addressed Congress a couple of times. Even his so-called farewell address was not given orally. It was a written statement that was published in the paper. And then when Thomas Jefferson became president, he eliminated entirely the idea that the president should go and speak before Congress. And so presidents from Jefferson to Woodrow Wilson, they did not speak to Congress. So presidents in the 19th century did not have to be good public speakers, and nobody knows if they were or not. Andrew Jackson was not known for public speaking. Abraham Lincoln was not a good public speaker. His second inaugural address and the Gettysburg Address were wonderful pieces of political prose, but his delivery was abysmal. It's only when we get to the modern era, especially with radio and with television, and with Theodore Roosevelt was a good speaker, and presidents since then have Ronald Reagan's a great speaker. So it's that kind of thing. And so you asked early on, Nathan, so at least I inferred this from what you said. So what was it that made Washington a good president? And I had said, what makes any president a good president, he fits his times, but there's something special about Washington. And it's one of the things that I really had to figure out. It's also one of the reasons that I took such a long time getting around to writing about Washington. I'd written several biographies, big biographies of important figures, but not Washington. And one of the reasons I avoided Washington was I didn't get him. I couldn't have told you what was the secret of success. But then when I committed to write about Washington, I figured I better come up with some answer to the question. And I concluded that it was both the most important quality in any leader in any circumstance, and also the one that is hardest to define and even harder to predict in advance. And that is good judgment, the ability to make wise decisions. And that really is what we choose our leaders for, whether it's the leader of a corporation or the leader of your Kiwanis Club or president of the United States. If they make good decisions, they will be a successful leader. And if they make bad decisions, they won't. But one of the reasons it's so hard to predict in advance is that there's no office quite like the presidency. So the presidency is kind of like an overgrown governor of a big state, but governors don't do foreign policy. So can this president make good decisions, foreign policy? With Washington, I'm going to say almost invariably, he made good decisions, both as commanding general of the Continental Army and as president of the United States. Now, how do I know they're good decisions? Well, good decisions are only identified as such after the fact. The decision is made. Now, did it have the expected and positive effect? So if you look at Washington's decisions as president, we'll focus there. It's nearly impossible to pick out a decision. Boy, that was a dumb thing to do. Some of his decisions were controversial. He signed the bill that caused the federal government to assume the debts of the states. and to create a Bank of the United States. And so these were controversial, but they turned out to be okay. And so then the question for the biographer like me is so how did he do this? Why were his decisions better than other people's decisions? And I can give you the characteristics of his decision-making process. But in this, I have to say that this is a little bit like explaining why Ted Williams was a good hitter in baseball. Now, Ted Williams made more outs than he made hits. His lifetime average was, high
344.
There you go. Okay. So 3 out of 4 times he makes an out. Okay. So, but he's better than other people. So what makes him better than other people? What made Washington a better decision maker than other people? One is he was slow to make decisions. He did not rush to judgment. He gathered all the information from all the interested and knowledgeable parties. For example, when he was commander-in-chief, he would hold his councils of war. He would bring in all of the generals around and other higher officers, bring them in and ask them for opinions. And he would weigh their opinions. He wouldn't tip his hand. He wouldn't say, this is what I want to do. What do you think? He'd say, what do you think? What do you think? And he'd withhold his judgment to the end. When he was president, he would hold cabinet meetings. And sometimes he would ask the members of his cabinet to submit their recommendations in writing. And so he would really get the full breadth of the views. When the bill about the Bank of the United States was passed, he refused to tip his hand as to whether he was going to veto the bill or not. It was of dubious constitutionality, maybe not. You could interpret the Constitution one way or the other. And he was so far from tipping his hand that he invited James Madison, then who was a member of Congress, invited him in and asked him to help draft a message as to what he would do regarding this bill for the Bank of the United States. And he had Madison write 2 versions, one justifying signing the bill and the other one justifying vetoing the bill. And when Madison came out, he said, I don't know what he's going to do. So there's that. He withholds his judgment until the very end. He didn't make decisions that didn't yet have to be made. When he did make decisions, if he had to bend the rules to make decisions, for example, as president, he was going to be bending the rules because the rules were so sketchily written for the president. What can a president do? Well, it doesn't say much. He's supposed to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and see that the laws are faithfully executed, but there's a lot of wiggle room there. So one of the first important decisions that Washington made on foreign policy was to decide that when Britain and France went to war in 1793, that the United States would maintain a neutral position. Now, this was a little bit controversial in that the United States still had a lingering alliance with France. And it was written originally as a perpetual alliance. But Washington decided to ignore that and not go to the aid of France, nor go to the aid of Britain. And he realized that he was going out on a constitutional limb here because the Constitution does not give the president the authority to do that. If the authority to claim neutrality lay anywhere in American politics, it should lie with Congress, because Congress had the authority to declare war, so presumably Congress had the authority to declare non-war, that is, neutrality. But Washington realized that now it was really up to him. He could push it either way. And he also realized that if he made a decision that was broadly popular, nobody would complain about the procedure. And so he recognized that there was no great support in the United States for joining this war, this European war. And so he says, we are going to, on his own hook, he says, we proclaim neutrality. And people of the United States had great idea. Congress basically had great idea. A few constitutional sticklers said, wait, where did you get that authority? But Washington also understood that if you make the decision people want, they're not going to argue about how the decision was made. And so Washington started down the very long path that culminates, for now, in Donald Trump, of pushing the boundaries of the executive power. And this was my first one, and this is the way executive power grows. People seize the decision on an issue that nobody really cares enough to push back against. But now they've planted this precedential and presidential flag, and nobody's going to take it back.
I'd like to close with this question, which I hope is a little bit fun. But of all the great Americans you've written about, if you could have dinner with them, who would you want at your table?
Well, how many do I get?
5.
Oh my gosh, 5. Okay. Well, I would want Benjamin Franklin because he was the best dinner guest I've ever encountered anywhere. So he needs to be there. I would probably wind up inviting Theodore Roosevelt, but I would have to recognize that there's a possibility that Theodore Roosevelt would simply seize the floor of the dinner and never let anybody else talk. Roosevelt had this habit of inviting distinguished people to dine with him at the White House. And these are great authors, scientists, and so on. And then they would come, and he would proceed to lecture them on their area of expertise for an hour. And Henry Adams, after visiting the White House, he said, I came home and I just had to wring the Theodore Roosevelt out of me. So it'd be those two. It would be interesting to bring Andrew Jackson along because he was a gentleman. He had punctilious behavior, but he also was a man of great feeling, and you didn't want to cross him. It would be interesting to see how he would react. Abraham Lincoln would be very interesting because Lincoln was, and with Lincoln, it would have to depend on sort of where in his career we got him. I've never encountered a president who grew more in office than Lincoln did. The Lincoln that was inaugurated in March of 1861 was a political novice, and he knew he was a novice. He was a good lawyer, but he didn't know what kind of moral force he had. He didn't know what kind of war leader he would be. And the Lincoln that gave the second inaugural address 4 years later was an entirely different person. So if I could get him early on, the thing the dinner group would have to deal with, though, is to put up with Lincoln's very bizarre sense of humor, because Lincoln would tell these shaggy dog stories. And then, I don't know if I'm to 5 yet, but I'd like to bring Franklin Roosevelt along. And the reason I'd like to bring Franklin Roosevelt along is, of all the public figures, including presidents that I've dealt with, Roosevelt is the one who, to me, even after writing 800 pages on him, remains very much a mystery to me. Because whereas Washington was a little bit unknowable because he didn't say much, Roosevelt said too much, but it's almost impossible to tell what he intended seriously. And Roosevelt had this habit of bringing people into his office. And so 3 people would come in, and they've got different positions on the Social Security Bill of 1935 or something like that. And here's somebody comes in who's all in favor of it. And Roosevelt, he had this habit when he was listening to people talk, it encouraged them to talk. We saying, yes, just go on. And people would often read that as, oh, I agree with you. Yes. So, but they would just draw them out. And that person would leave saying, he's on my side. Next person would come in, argue just the opposite. And Roosevelt would go, oh, yes. Those two would go out, and they would think, he's on my side. No, he's on my side. And so he'd make a decision, and he would alienate at least one or the other. So Roosevelt did not keep a diary. Franklin Roosevelt did not keep a diary. He wrote letters, but they were unrevealing. The most revealing documents on Franklin Roosevelt were his press conferences, transcripts of his press conference. He held these press conferences twice a week for 12 years. So there's lots of stuff. And it's a small group, and it's a group of, it's a little bit like Roosevelt doing stand-up comedy. It's not because they're a joke, but because it's a small group, and they all feel part of this thing. And Roosevelt made the reporters feel almost like co-conspirators. And this was in the days before press conferences were broadcast. And they also were done on background rules. The president could not be quoted unless the president said, you can quote me, because he may say something. Reporters say, can we quote you on that? No, yes, or so on. And so he's an expert at manipulating this small group. And he's just wonderful in the kind of retail politics of this. So to mix that group together would be very interesting to see how it worked out.
Wonderful. Well, Mr. Brand, this has been a wonderful conversation. I hope that George and I can score an invite to that dinner if you find a way to bring them back.
But we're also in the back row.
Yeah, we're also down for just dinners in DC or Austin. You have a fantastic book about Washington that's out, along with, again, 30 other really great ones, which the ones for me, TR and FDR and on Ike and MacArthur are fantastic. Where can our listeners find your books, which they should read because people need to read more? So.
They're all on Amazon. You can find them.
I love it. Yeah. I love it. Well, thank you again for the time, and we'll see you at dinner.
See you, Nathan. George, good to talk to you.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share with friends.